you go up in energy per particle millions of times. Now, you'd think when you get small, there'd be less energy, wouldn't you? But it doesn't work that way. So as we probe inside the atom, I'm sure we'll find more ways of doing things. Also, we will probably figure out anti-gravity. I mean, you could say a rocket is an anti-gravity device. After all, gravity pulls down and it pushes up, so it's anti-gravity. But we don't know a lot about gravity. And it may be that there's a crazy world of superconducting magnets, materials that have no resistance to the flow of electricity if you keep them cold enough. And that means you can generate a huge magnetic field without having to use a lot of energy. Now, we know that there are diamagnetic substances, things that are repelled by a magnetic field. Maybe we can make stuff that's diagravitational, that is repelled by an appropriate gravitational field. I don't know how to do that. I'm sorry. I haven't been working on this for the last 50 years.
This is fascinating. Can you talk about Project Blue Book, Report 14? Because this seems to be an overriding theme and critical document that overlays everything with regard to evidence.
Yeah, I stumbled across this. I mean, I read my first book in 1958 by Captain Edward Ruppelt, who was head of Project Blue Book in the early 50s. And it intrigued me. It didn't convince me, but it intrigued me. I shared it with a neighbor, an engineer 10 years older than I was, and he was more intrigued than I was. So I respected Charlie, and I read 15 more books, some of which were junk. If I'd read them first, I'd have never read another one. And then I stumbled at the University of California, Berkeley, in a privately published version of Project Blue Book Special Report number 14. Now, I was surprised because, in all the books that I'd read, none of them had mentioned it. You know, how do you get to number 14? Where's 1 through 13 is also a question. And secondly, I was in data heaven. I mean, charts, tables, graphs, maps. Wow, just what I like. Lots of data. But the guy who had somehow gotten a copy and reproduced it included the Air Force press release when this thing was completed in 1955, October. In it, the Secretary of the Air Force is quoted as saying, on the basis of this report, didn't give the title, interestingly enough, we believe that no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been explained as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observational data had been available. Well, that sounds pretty straightforward. We did a lot of looking. They didn't say who did the work or where the work was done, but we did a lot of looking, nothing to it. Well, I had the report, and I was looking at the tables and the graphs and stuff. Holy cow, the unknowns were 21.5%. They weren't 3%. That's not a round-off error. Furthermore, there's a separate category, insufficient information, 9.3%. So it was lying through his teeth. Now, working under security, you get careful about what you say, and sometimes you tiptoe around the truth a little bit, not to let out classified information. But this was so blatant, it really made me angry. And I was determined to get to the bottom of this. And the report, incidentally, not only covered 3,201 sightings, but they did a quality evaluation of all of them. The better the quality, the more likely to be unexplainable. They did a cross-comparison between the unknowns and the knowns. Now, they had a rule, incidentally. No report could be listed as an unknown unless all 4 of the final report evaluators agreed. Any 2 could label it anything else. And still, they found that the probability that the unknowns were just knowns, they did a statistical cross-comparison, a chi-square analysis for people like math, and the probability that the unknowns were just misknowns was less than 1%. Now, the data in that report, in other words, throws out almost all the objections by the noisy negativists. Carl Sagan and I were classmates for 3 years. Yet on a couple of occasions, he said, there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable. There are reliable sightings that aren't interesting, but there are no interesting and reliable sightings. No references given, and it's totally false. The highest percentage of unknowns were from the most reliable sightings. So that book, and I'm still distributing copies of it because you can't get it anyplace else. It's listed on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com. But for people to make all kinds of silly claims without referencing that report, and it's one of my complaints about the SETI guys, they say there is no evidence, and there's no mention of the 5 large-scale scientific studies that I discuss in Flying Saucers and Science. Seth Shostak was at a lecture I gave. We each gave 3 lectures on Queen Elizabeth II and a trip, its last westward voyage. And after each one of these studies, I describe it, show a slide, tell what's in it, and then ask, how many people here have read this? And typically, it's under 2%. Seth didn't raise his hand for any of the 5 documents I talk about. But if you look at this SETI literature, there's no mention of not only this, but the other studies. Now, the first job of a scientist going to make a pronouncement about something should be to study the evidence. I feel very strongly about that. And when I find out they haven't studied the evidence, and what is their opinion worth? What's that based on? Research by proclamation. 4 basic rules for debunkers. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier. And do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble, and nobody will know the difference anyway. So I'm very wary and very cynical about the debunkers. And the same rules apply in any field. You'll run into the same approach by debunkers. It's a fact of life, and I'm sorry about it. I wish it weren't that way. I wish I could say scientists are objective and careful, and they collect data first, announce conclusion later. It's simply not true.
SETI seems to be a waste of money to me, knowing the evidence that's available to people. It seems like a huge waste of money.
It makes good jobs for people, and I think it stands for silly effort to investigate. And in case people think I'm talking, out of the side of my mouth, I have debated with Seth, Coast to Coast Radio. I got 57% of the vote. He got 33%, and 10% said, I don't know. I'm willing to take on any of them because I find they haven't done their homework. And, that's disturbing to me as a scientist because I was one of these starry-eyed kids who thought science was the pursuit of truth. Of course, I thought journalism was a pursuit of truth, too.
Good luck on that.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, in case people are listening and wondering, why doesn't he speak up to these guys? I have. And anybody wants to set up a debate, be happy to be involved. But I might suggest to my opponent that maybe he read one of my books. Seth did say on Coast to Coast once that he had Flying Saucers and Science on his night table. He didn't say he'd read it, of course. I read his books. I read, that's one of the rules of debating. Dr. Michael Shermer, he and I debated. I got 80% of the vote with him because he really didn't know anything. And, you're going to express a viewpoint. Do your homework.
What do you think about the 5th Annual Global Competitiveness Forum in Saudi Arabia, which you were a member of this 5-person panel, along with Michio Kaku, and ex-presidents have come there. A lot of people in high places have been there.
Yeah.
Why are they talking now about contact in outer space?
Well, that was my first thought was this outfit legitimate? I've never heard of the Saudi Arabian General Investment Agency. I thought somebody's pulling my leg here, but I checked and they're real. And so my thought was the same as when I first heard the Pope's comment about, maybe God made our brethren in outer space just like he made us, no big deal. And my first thought was, what does he know that we don't know? Is he getting ready for the world's billion-plus Catholics to be ready for disclosure? And I wondered, do these guys know something? Well, one of the people who was involved in inviting me, I did find out, had a sighting himself. But their whole focus was on innovation. And my response was, as I said before, that my mantra, if you will, is technological progress comes from doing things differently. And they're looking at the whole picture of competitiveness, and that includes innovation. And they looked at the need for freedom to fail, willingness to take risk, educating your people, being aware that the future belongs to those who invest now. And you see a good counter example of that is Egypt versus Saudi Arabia.